Have you ever noticed how easily your mind just sort of follows along when you're really engrossed in a good story? Like idea by idea, feeling by feeling.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's pretty amazing.
It is.
But, it turns out that might be a completely different way of processing information than how those super advanced AI language models handle text,
Hmm.
even though they're becoming so good at writing stories that sound like a human wrote them.
That's such an interesting point because, there's this idea out there that these AI tools, the ones that can write whole articles and hold conversations,
Right.
that they're becoming more and more like us.
Yeah.
Like they understand things the way we do.
Uh-huh.
And more it's true, they can produce some pretty incredible stuff. The way they actually make sense of a story might be totally different from how your brain does it.
Exactly. And you know what? That brings us to today's dive. We had a listener write in with a really great question.
Oh, cool.
They were curious about the research that's been done comparing how our brains process narratives to the methods used by large language models.
LMs.
Yeah, LLMs.
I love that we have a listener question for this one.
Me too. I think it's going to be a great topic.
Yeah, and it's something we all experience, right? I mean, everyone has listened to a story or read a book.
Right. So for this deep dive, we found some super compelling research to explore.
Fantastic.
To put it simply, the question is, how does your brain actually put a story together, piece by piece, as it unfolds over time?
Yeah.
And is that anything like how an AI model, like the ones that power chatbot or write those articles we were talking about, is that how they do it?
It really makes you think about how we build context. How much information is your brain actively holding on to at any given moment? And how does it connect that with everything you've already heard or read in the story?
Yeah. And a great place to start is this research paper titled Incremental Accumulation of Linguistic Context in Artificial and Biological Neural Networks.
Okay.
It's kind of a mouthful, I know.
A little bit.
But what's really cool is that they looked at fMRI data from real people listening to stories.
Okay.
And they compared that brain activity to computational models using LLMs.
Very cool. I mean, this paper really gets into the nuts and bolts of how we understand a story as it unfolds, using some pretty clever experimental formulas and theories.
Yes, and so that's exactly what we're going to do in this deep dive. We're going to break down the key findings of this research.
Great.
We'll especially focus on how context is processed
Okay.
and what those experimental formulas and the underlying theories actually show us.
Sounds a bit technical.
I know it sounds a little technical, but don't worry.
Okay, good.
We're going to make it super clear.
Let's start with the basics. How do these large language models,
LLMs.
yeah, LLMs, how do they approach a big chunk of text, like, say, a chapter in a book?
Right. So standard LLMs, the kind that power a lot of the AI we see today,
Right.
they're really good at taking in these large blocks of words all at once.
Uh-huh.
They're called context windows.
Okay, context windows.
And these windows can be huge. They can have up to thousands of words.
Thousands.
Thousands. And then they use attention mechanisms
Okay.
to figure out how all those words relate to each other.
Within that giant window.
Exactly.
That's why. So it's kind of like having this huge puzzle
Yeah.
all laid out in front of you.
Right.
And they're looking at every piece at the same time.
Exactly.
And the important thing is these context windows, even though they're big, they have a limit.
Yes.
And there's only so much they can hold.
Right. Now, think about your own brain when you're listening to me talk right now.
Okay.
Or maybe when you're listening to an audiobook.
Okay.
Are you keeping track of thousands of my words in your mind at the same time?
No way.
Probably not, right? So how does our brain do it?
That's the question, isn't it?
It is.
So it seems like our brains work more like we're processing the language word by word as we hear it or read it,
Okay.
like a continuous stream of information coming in.
Yeah.
And we're not stuck with that fixed window of thousands of words. Instead, our brains seem to use what the researchers called an online mechanism.
Okay.
It's constantly taking in new words and weaving them into our understanding.
Okay.
It's like building a puzzle, but we only get one piece at a time.
Right.
And each new piece adds to the picture.
It's a much more dynamic process.
Yeah, it's more dynamic and it's always updating.
And that leads us to the first phase of this study, where they actually compared what was happening in the brain with this LLM processing.
So cool. Okay, so walk me through this experiment.
Okay.
What did they actually do?
Well, they used fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging,
Okay.
to see what was happening in the brains of a bunch of people as they were listening to stories.
I see. So like real-time brain activity.
Yes, they had over 200 participants.
Wow, that's a lot of data.
It is.
And what kind of stories did they use?
They had 8 different spoken narratives
Okay.
that they had people listen to.
Were they like, long stories or short
Peak of
stories?
those about 7 minutes long or even longer.
Oh, wow. Okay, so substantial narratives.
Yeah. And while people were listening, they were gathering all this data about what was going on in their brains.
Fascinating. So they're seeing how the brain lights up, literally, as the story unfolds.
Yes. Then they took these LLM embeddings, which is like, imagine it's a really sophisticated dictionary, but multidimensional.
Multi-dimensional dictionary.
Yeah. It captures all the relationships between words, not just their definitions.
Oh, interesting. So it's not just about what a word means, but how it connects to other words.
Exactly. And they used a model that was kind of like GPT-3
Okay.
to create these embeddings for each word in the stories.
I see. So they're giving the AI a way to understand the words in a way that's similar to how we think about words and their relationship.
Exactly.
So what did they do with these embeddings?
Well, they wanted to see how well these LLM embeddings could predict what they were seeing in the brain activity.
I see. So they're basically asking, can the AI, using its understanding of the words, anticipate what's happening in the brain as someone listens?
Yes. And here's the key part. They changed the size of LLM's context window.
The context window, that's the amount of text the AI looks at once, right?
Yes. They started really small, like 8 tokens, that all the way up to over 2,000.
Wow, that's a huge range. Now, just to be clear, what's a token exactly?
Oh, right. A token is kind of like the basic unit that these models use. It can be a whole word, part of a word, even punctuation.
Okay, so like though would be one token,
Yes.
un in understanding would be another,
Huh.
and a comma would be its own token.
Exactly.
Got it. So they were essentially trying to find out how much context does the LLM need to look at to best match what's happening in the brain?
Yes. And you might think, well, the more context, the better, right?
You'd think so, yeah.
Like the more the AI sees, the better it should understand.
Right, like it can get the bigger picture.
But
But
here's the thing. The results were really surprising.
okay, I'm intrigued. What did you find?
The predictions did get better as they made the context window bigger,
Okay,
but only up to a point,
up to a point.
around 32 tokens.
32 tokens.
Yeah, which is like a few sentences.
Wow, that's a lot smaller than those thousands of words the model is capable of handling.
Right. And after 32, it either plateaued, like it stopped getting better,
Okay.
or it actually got worse.
Really?
Yeah. And this was true across different parts of the brain.
So no matter where they looked in the brain,
Yeah.
more context wasn't always better.
And they even tried different LLMs.
Not just GPT-3.
Yeah, not just GPT-3. They used others that were specifically designed for long contexts,
Oh, interesting.
like long T5 and Transformer XL.
So models are supposed to be good at remembering lots of information.
Exactly. But even with those, the same thing happened.
So it's not just about the specific model. There seems to be something more fundamental about how much context is helpful in understanding what's happening in the brain.
Right. And to make sure this wasn't a fluke, they did a head-to-head comparison. They looked at how well the 32 token window did
Uh-huh.
compared to the biggest one, the one with thousands of words.
Oh, wow. Okay, a real showdown.
Yeah. And you know what? In over 2,500 different locations in the brain,
Okay.
that tiny window, the 32 token one, was way better at predicting brain responses.
Wow. So that really suggests that a very long context, even though the models can handle it, isn't actually helpful for understanding what's happening in our brains at that moment.
Right?
That's really significant.
Yeah. It means that when your brain is processing language,
Uh-huh.
like right now, as you're listening,
Yeah.
the most important information for understanding what's happening in your brain comes from a period of time.
A few sentences?
Just a few sentences.
Which means our brains aren't processing thousands of words all at once like those big LLMs.
Exactly.
That's so interesting because it suggests that simply making AI models bigger and bigger,
Yeah.
giving them more and more to process at once,
Right.
might not be the key to truly understanding language like we do.
Yeah. So fascinating.
It is, and it makes sense when you think about it, right? Like when you're listening to a story,
Uh-huh.
you're not constantly going back and rethinking everything you've heard from the very beginning with every new word.
Right.
It would be exhausting.
It would?
Your brain has to be more efficient than that.
Yeah, it does.
And that's where the next part of the study comes in, right?
Yeah.
What did they do next?
Well, they realized that these fixed window LLMs had limitations.
Okay.
So they tried to create a new kind of LLM model
Yeah, right.
that worked more like the brain.
I see. So not just making the window smaller.
Right.
but actually changing how the model processed information over time.
Exactly.
I'm curious, before we landed on this new approach,
Uh-huh.
did they try any other ways to make the models more brain-like?
They really did. They
Yeah.
tried a bunch of different things with the context window,
Okay.
and they tried different memory mechanisms.
So it was a lot of experimenting before they found something that really worked.
Yes.
And what did they come up with? What was this new type of model?
They call it the incremental context model.
The incremental context model. I like that name.
It sounds more like what our brains do, right?
Yeah, like a step-by-step process.
Yeah, exactly.
So what's at the heart of this model? How does it work?
Well, it has two main parts.
Okay.
First is the incoming short-term context,
Short-term context. Okay.
which is basically a small window with the most recent words.
Okay, so it's still keeping track of what's just happened.
Right. And remember, they found that 32 tokens was that sweet spot?
Uh-huh.
They used that finding here. So it's a window of about 32 tokens.
Makes sense. So the model has access to those recent sentences. What's the other part?
The second part is called the aggregated prior context.
Aggregated prior context. Okay.
And this is where it gets really brain-like.
Okay.
Instead of just having a fixed window looking back,
Uh-huh.
Dot model keeps a running summary of everything that's happened in the story up to that point.
Oh, interesting. Like a mental notepad.
Yes. And here's the really cool part. The LLM itself creates this summary.
Wait, so its model is summarizing the story as it goes along.
Yes. Incrementally, just like our brains seem to do.
That's amazing. It's like the model is constantly updating its understanding of the story based on what it's already read.
Exactly.
So how does it use these two sources of information, the short-term stuff and the summary?
Okay, so every time the model encounters a new word,
Uh-huh.
it looks at the recent context, those 32 tokens or so,
Right.
and it also consults its own summary of what came before,
Okay.
and it uses both of those to process the current word.
Got it.
Then
Yeah.
IT updates the summary with that new information.
Wow. So it's a continuous cycle. It
Uh-huh.
reads a bit,
Uh-huh.
summarizes what it's read,
Yeah.
and uses that to understand the next bit.
And that sounds a lot like how we experience a story, right?
It does. Like, think about it. When you're listening to a story, you don't remember every single word,
Right.
but you have the sense of what's happened so far,
Yeah.
like a mental summary.
Uh-huh.
And then you fit the new information into that summary.
Exactly. So they came up with this incremental model that's more like our brains.
Yeah.
But how did it do? Was it better at predicting brain activity?
That's the big question, right? Did it actually work?
Well, they compared this incremental model to two others.
Okay.
The first was a standard LLM, but with just that short 32 token window. And the second was a standard LLM with the full-size window up to 2048 tokens.
So they were testing the incremental model against a short-term context model and a long-term context model.
Yeah. And they wanted to make sure it was a fair comparison, so all three models were built on the same basic LLM architecture.
Right. So the only real difference was how they handled the context.
Exactly.
What were the results?
Okay, so first of all, the incremental model was way better at predicting the brain signals than the one with the massive context window.
Okay.
And it wasn't just in one area, it was across lots of different regions in the parietal, temporal, and frontal lobes.
Wow. So the incremental model, the one that constantly summarizes the story, was much better aligned with brain activity than the one trying to juggle a huge amount of context all at once.
Right.
That's really strong evidence that maybe our brains are doing something more like incrementally building understanding.
It is, and it's not just about efficiency either.
What do you mean?
When they compared it to that model with just the 32 token window,
Okay.
it was even better at predicting activity in certain areas of the brain,
Oh, interesting. Where in the brain?
specifically in parts of the default mode network, or DMN.
The DMN. Now, remind me, what is the default mode network again?
It's a network of brain regions that it's kind of like our internal mental workspace.
Okay, I remember hearing about this.
Yeah, it's active when we're not focused on a specific task.
Uh,
But it's also really important for things like understanding narratives,
Right.
making inferences,
Huh.
and processing information over longer periods of time.
Ah, so it's the part of the brain that's sort of piecing things together, making connections, building that overall sense of story.
Exactly.
So the incremental model, which is constantly summarizing the past, was even better at predicting what was going on in these higher level regions involved in narrative comprehension.
Yes. It's like those areas need that continuous summary to make sense of things.
Fascinating. And what about the areas where the short-term model was better?
Right? It turned out that the model, with just the 32 token window, point, it did a better job predicting activity in lower level areas.
Lower level meaning?
areas involved in processing the sounds of language and basic word meanings.
Oh, I see.
Areas like the superior temporal gyrus, which is where the auditory cortex is,
Okay.
and the inferior frontal gyrus, which includes Broca's area.
So those areas that are more focused on the immediate sound and structure of the words
Yes.
makes sense that they would rely more heavily on the immediate context.
Right, because they're not necessarily involved in building that long-term understanding of the story.
Exactly. So it seems like our brains have this really amazing system where different regions focus on different timescales of information.
Right, like a hierarchy, but all working together.
Yeah, and the incremental model, by incorporating that constantly updating summary,
Uh-huh.
it captures that dynamic interplay between different timescales.
It does. Okay, so they had these different LLM models and saw how well they matched up with brain activity in different regions.
Uh-huh.
But they didn't stop there.
Really? What else did they do?
In the third phase of their study, they actually looked at the fMRI data itself
Okay.
without relying on the LLM models at all.
Oh, interesting. So a completely different way of looking at things.
Exactly. They used a technique called model-free spectral analysis.
Model-free spectral analysis.
It's a mouthful.
It is.
But basically, they were analyzing the raw brain activity patterns.
Got it. So no AI interpretation this time, just looking at the brain itself.
Right. And they were looking at the frequency of the bull signal.
Bold, remind me.
Blood oxygen level dependent.
Right, the signal that fMRI measures,
Yes.
which reflects changes in blood flow, indicating brain activity, right?
Uh-huh.
Okay. So they looked at how quickly or slowly the bold signal was changing in different brain areas.
Yes. And the idea is how fast those signals are changing can tell you something about how the brain is processing information.
Okay, so like fast changes might mean.
That the blank is focusing on something that's happening right now,
Right.
like the most recent words,
Okay.
but slower changes
Yeah,
might mean it's integrating information over a longer time period.
I see. So it's like different tempos of brain activity.
Yeah, exactly. Like low frequency, those slow changes,
Uh-huh.
they're probably connected to processing longer stretches of information.
Okay.
Like remembering what happened earlier in the story,
Okay.
but higher frequencies, those fast changes,
Uh-huh.
those are probably related to shorter context.
The immediate information.
Right.
That's neat how they can connect the speed of brain activity to how the brain is handling the story.
Right. So to test this out, they focused on high frequency activity first.
Okay.
They thought this would be related to processing timescales of around 32 tokens or less.
Short-term context.
Yeah. And what they found was really interesting.
What did they find?
There was a strong negative correlation
Negative correlation. Okay.
between this high frequency power
Uh-huh.
and the difference in how well the incremental model and that short 32 token LLM predicted brain activity.
Okay, so a negative correlation. That means as the high frequency power went up,
Yes,
it's between the model's predictions went down.
exactly.
So what does that actually tell us?
It means that in brain areas that really liked those fast high frequency signals,
Okay.
which suggests they prefer short time scales,
Uh-huh.
the simple short-term LLM actually did a better job predicting the brain activity than the fancy incremental one.
I see. So those areas that are all about the here and now, the immediate words,
Right.
they're better captured by a model that's just looking at the most recent context.
Exactly. And then they did the same analysis for low frequency activity,
Okay.
which they thought would be associated with longer timescales.
Right, like 256 tokens or more.
Yeah. And guess what?
What?
They found a strong positive correlation.
Positive correlation, so the opposite of what they found with the high frequency activity.
Yes. So areas with more low frequency power,
Mm-hmm.
the ones that seem to process over longer periods,
Right.
those were better predicted by the incremental model.
The one with the summary, so it seems like those areas that are building a bigger picture of the story
Yes.
are more in sync with a model that's constantly summarizing the past.
Exactly.
And all of this is based on just looking at the brain signals themselves without any interpretation from the LLMs.
Right.
It really strengthens their findings.
It does. It means that different parts of our brains are tuned to different timescales of information.
Yeah.
And the incremental model, the one that summarizes,
Uh-huh.
it's doing something similar to what those higher order brain regions involved in story comprehension are doing.
So cool. It's like they found a computational model that reflects something real about how our brains work.
Right. It's not just about matching behavior anymore. It's about actually understanding the brain.
It really sheds light on the nuts and bolts of how we understand stories. I mean, the fact that they used fMRI and computational modeling to compare brain activity to how those LLMs process information,
Right.
and then backed it up with this model-free spectral analysis,
Yeah.
that's really solid evidence. It paints a clear picture of how our brains make meaning from language over time.
It is. And it's so wild to think about, like when you're listening to a story,
Yeah.
you're not consciously thinking about every single detail from the beginning.
You don't have to,
Yeah.
because your brain is creating this summary as you go.
Yeah. Right. And it's fitting new information into that summary constantly.
So amazing.
So we've learned that our brains are processing narratives in a way that's totally different from how most of these big LLMs do it.
Right. And that simply having huge context window
Uh-huh.
doesn't necessarily mean better understanding,
No, it doesn't.
and that our brains might be relying on something much more dynamic.
Like a constantly updating summary.
Yeah, like this incremental model.
Right. And it's this hierarchy in the brain
Uh-huh.
with different regions focusing on different timescales.
Yeah.
That seems to be key to how we make sense of stories.
It makes you wonder, though,
What?
if our brains are doing this incredible incremental summarization thing,
Uh-huh.
could we create AI that does the same?
Mm.
And what would happen if we did? Would it unlock a whole new level of understanding in AI?
That's a great question to ponder. Like, imagine if AI could process information the way we do,
Yeah.
summarizing as it goes, integrating new details.
Right.
It might be able to really understand the nuances of language,
Uh-huh.
the way a story fits together, things that are hard for current models.
Yeah, like the emotional tone, the subtle connections between events, the overall coherence of a long narrative.
Exactly. It's pretty mind-blowing.
It is. It really makes you think about the possibilities.
So this has been a super fascinating deep dive into how our brains and AI understand stories.
It has lots to think about.
If you're as intrigued by this as we are,
Uh-huh.
you could definitely go deeper.
Yeah, there's so much more to learn.
You could look into neural encoding,
Okay.
the default mode network,
Uh-huh.
the transformer architecture.
That's the backbone of many of these AI models.
Exactly. And of course, you can always check out the original research paper.
Yeah, that's a great idea.
It has all the details about how they did the experiments, the formulas, and everything.
Thanks for choosing this topic. It was super interesting.
Yeah, thanks to our listener for suggesting it, and thank you for joining us for this deep dive.